Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we continue with the reign of Bahram Gur. Bahman, Rusbeh, and 1,000 horsemen went hunting and came on a plain filled with wild asses. It was spring, and the males were searching for females and fighting with one another. They bit one another's hides so viciously that the ground was stained ruby red with their blood. Bahram watched one such combat until the animals separated in their fury, and the victorious male mounted a female. Bahram smiled to see the animal's pleasure and drew back his bow. The arrow entered the male's back, and the whole shaft sank in up to the feathers, pinning the male and the female together. Those in his entourage who had seen the shot congratulated the king and said, "May the evil eye be far from you, and all your days be like the festival. You have no equal in the world. You are a king, an emperor, and a hero." Bahram was riding Shabrang and urged him forward to a thicket where he saw a pair of lions. He drew back his bow, and the arrow entered the male lion's chest when it passed through, and then plunged into the ground. He then loosed an arrow at the female, which pinned her thigh to the earth. He said, "That last arrow had no feathers, and its point was blunt." His soldiers all congratulated him and said, "No one has ever seen a king like you. You can subdue a lion with a flightless arrow. You can overturn a granite mountain." Bahram and his companions rode in the meadows. They saw a grove of trees where there were many sheep, but the shepherds were fleeing as if fear of some danger. The head shepherd ran towards Bahram, who asked, "Who has brought these sheep to such a dangerous place?" The man replied, "In all the world, I'm the only man brave enough to come here. These sheep belong to a jeweler, and I brought them down from the mountain yesterday. The owner of the flock is rich, and he's always worried about danger. He has donkeys loads of jewels, as well as gold and silver. He has just one daughter, who plays the harp, and whose hair is a mass of ringlets. He'll only take his wine from her hand. No one's ever seen an old man like him. And if it weren't for King Bahram's just rule, how would he be able to keep his wealth? The King of Kings isn't greedy for gold, and his chief priest isn't an unjust man either. Won't you tell me who killed those two savage beasts? May God preserve him." Bahram replied, "These two lions were killed by a brave warrior, and then he left. He rode away with 7 companions, but where's this jeweler's house? Tell me how to get there, but don't hide anything." The head shepherd answered him, "Go straight ahead, and you'll come to a recently built village. The fame of this place has reached the town and even King Bahram's palace. When the heavens spread their black silk over the world, the jeweler starts his merrymaking. If you wait there a while, you'll hear toasts and the sound of a harp." Bahram asked for a pack horse and royal clothes. Then he left his vizier and the soldiers and went off with his head full of high hopes. Rusbeh said to the priests and courtiers, "Now the king is going to that village. He'll sit down in the jeweler's house, and you mark my word, he'll ask her father for that young woman's hand. There's no doubt he'll put a gold crown on her head. He can never get enough of sleeping with women, and in the darkness of the night, his sleeping partners run away from him. He keeps more than 100 at a time there. Who ever heard of such a king?" The chief eunuch had counted 930 nobly born women in his harem, and all of them have their diadems and jewels and crowns and bracelets and golden thrones and bejeweled bezant brocade. None of them are left without their own wealth. He keeps demanding tribute from every country and province, and every year the tribute from Rome is spent on them. I grieve for our king's strength and stature, for that face of his with which he commands the court. No one's ever seen a man who could pin 2 wild asses together with one arrow. All this sleeping with women will destroy him. He'll soon be as soft as silk. His eyes will darken, his cheeks turn yellow, his body will become weak. His lips will turn blue, his hair will turn white from the scent of women, and white hair means you must despair of the world. His back will become bent while he's still young. So many evils come from associating with women. Once a month is sufficient for sex. If it's more than that, a man is just pouring his blood away. A wise young man should stick to once a month, and that's for the sake of having children. If you do it more than that, it weakens you, and when a man gets soft like that, his body becomes bloodless. And so the conversation went on as they made their way back to the palace, till one man said, "The sun has lost his way." Meanwhile, Bahram rode through the darkness, accompanied only by a groom. Hearing the sound of a harp, he directed his horse toward it and quickly reached the jeweler's house. He lifted the knocker on the door and asked for hospitality. One of the jeweler's maids, a kind woman, said, "Who's knocking at our door in the darkness of the night, and why?" Bahram answered, "This morning the king went hunting, and my horse was lamed under me, and I had no choice but to turn back. With a horse like this, and with its golden work bridle, I'm afraid it'll be set on by thieves, so I'm looking for shelter." The maid told her master, "There's a man who wants to stay with us. He says that people will steal his fine horse and its golden trappings, and that if he goes any further he'll be in difficulties." Her master said, "Open the door." And to Bahram he called out, "Come in, my boy." When Bahram entered, he saw a fine hallway with servants standing ready. He said to himself, "O God of justice, guide me now. May all my acts be just, and may I not follow the ways of pride and greed. Make me just as that my subjects rejoice in my existence. If my justice and knowledge increase, my memory will remain bright after my death. May all my subjects live as this jeweler does, with wine and sound of a harp." As he went further, he saw his host's daughter through a doorway. When the jeweler saw Bahram, he came forward and bowed his tall, straight body before him. He said, "May this night bring you good fortune, and make those who wish you ill your slaves." He spread a carpet and placed a cushion on it, and then quickly had a table laden with various kinds of food brought in. He told a servant to see to Bahram's horse, and Bahram's groom was given a separate table and a place to sleep. They brought a seat for the host, and he sat himself down next to the king. Then he made excuses for his hospitality and said, "You seem to be a lord of the marches. While you are a guest in my house, my body and soul are at your service." Bahram replied, "Who can find such a welcoming host in the darkness of the night? When we've eaten, we must drink wine and refresh ourselves with sleep. And we must not be ungrateful to God, because a man who forgets God lives in fear." A maid brought water in a bowl for them to wash their hands, and she stared at their guest in astonishment. The host called for the comforts of wine and music, and the maid brought red wine, roses, and wild saffron flowers. The host drank first, and then he washed the cup, which was very beautiful in musk and rosewater, and he passed it to Bahram and said, "And what's our wine drinker's name? I want to make a pact of friendship with you now, and seal it in the name of King Bahram." The king laughed long and loud, and he said, "My name is Goshhasp, and I'm a knight. I came because I heard the sounds of harp, not for somewhere to rest." His host replied, "The daughter of mine, she makes me so proud. I feel like my head's in the heavens. She serves wine, she plays the harp, and she sings better than anyone. Her name is Arizu." Then he called Arizu, who was as elegant as a cypress tree. "Bring your harp and show Goshhap what you can do." The harp player came before Bahram, moving as beautifully as she were a Hindu idol, and he said to him, "You are a fine knight, and in everything you look like a prince. You should understand that this house is here for your pleasure, and that my father is both your host and your treasurer. May the dark nights bring you good fortune, and lift your head above the clouds." Bahram replied, "Sit down and take your harp. I want a song now." Arizu lifted her harp and sang first a song in praise of the Zoroastrian priests. Then she sang a song in praise of her father. The harp itself seemed to weep in her hands, and as the silken strings began to speak, all her house was filled with the scent of jasmine. This was the song she sang for her father. "Mahai, a noble cypress tree that grows beside a bank where limpid water flows. Your musky hair's grown camphor white, your mind is gentle, and your voice is warm and kind. May wisdom nourish your good soul, and may confusion sweep your enemies away. You are like Feridun, that noble king, who valued freedom above everything, and your obedient Arizu lives only to devote her life to you. Now, you've guessed. I'm like a king who sees his armies conquer all his enemies." When she had finished her song, she turned toward the guest. Again she took up her harp, and she sang to him. "And you are like a prince whose heart's sincere, who's fortunate in war, who knows no fear, and any man who hasn't seen our king, great Bahram, of whom all musicians sing, should look upon your face without delay, since you resemble him in every way. Your cypress tall, reed slim, your walks astride. That's like a strutting pheasant in its pride. Your heart is like a lion, and your face shines with a pomegranate blossom's grace, as though a rose were washed in wine. You stand, and like a mountain dominate the land. No one has seen, no one will ever see, a man like you for war and victory. May Arzu live all her years for you, the dust beneath your feet, and all you do. The king was so overcome by her song and her playing, by her beauty, her bearing, and her voice, that made his heart, it was thrown into a tumult. When the wine had begun to affect Mahai, Bahram said to him, "If you want to be well thought of, give me your daughter in marriage." Mahai turned to Arzu and said, "Do you want this lion-hearted guest to pay court to you? Look at him a while, and see if he pleases you, and if you think you would like to live with him." Arzu said, "My kind and noble father, if you wish to give me to anyone, let it be none but this knight Goshap, who so resembles Bahram. Simply to sit with him for a while is like life itself." But Mahai did not accept his daughter's words, and he said to Bahram, "Look at her carefully, from head to foot. Consider her knowledge, diligence, and intelligence. See if she pleases you, and if she measures up to her reputation. She is a fine woman, and she is not poor. I'm not the one to compare my wealth with others, but if you count up Mahai's jewels, they come to more than you'd find in a king's purse. Even if you still want her, drink another cup of wine. There's no hurry. You should rest tonight. Men of standing don't enter into agreements when they're drunk, especially if they have any sense. Stay here till sunrise, and our elders have woken up, and then we can call together those who have patient hearts and are literate. It's against our custom to do these things in the darkness of the night. King Veradon would not have done it like this. And it's not auspicious to ask for a woman's hand, or to start on any new undertaking when one is drunk." Bahram replied, "There's no point in saying this, and it's a bad idea to start predicting what might happen. This harp player pleases me tonight, so you should stop all this talk about the future." Mahai turned to his daughter Arzu and said, "Does his character please you, and what he says?" She answered, "Yes, they do please me. My heart and soul have been his since I set eyes on him. Do it, and leave the rest to God. The heavens are not at war with Mahai." Her father replied, "Then you are now his wife, and you should understand that you now live for him." And she gave him to Bahram, who took her as his wife. As night began to turn to day, all that had happened as it should, and Arzu went through the sleeping household to her own room. In another part of the house, Mahai was preparing everything for his guest, the king Goshap. He said to a servant, "Lock the doors, and send someone to the shepherds. We can't have a meal without lamb, and it must be the best lamb, too. When he wakes up, take him some beer and some ice, and see that someone is there to serve him. Set a bowl of camphor mixed with rose water in his bedchamber so that it smells sweet. Despite the wine I drank, I feel as fresh as I did yesterday. Wine's not going to overcome this old jeweler." Having said this, he put the coverlet over his head and sank into an untroubled sleep. When the sun lifted its glowing crown into the sky, and the world glowed like a sea of ivory, Bahram's servant hung his master's whip on the door at the front of Mahai's house. The king's men were looking for some sign of their master, and as soon as they saw the whip, they began to gather in front of his house, as they would in front of the king's court, and everyone who recognized the whip went forward and greeted it respectfully. When Mahai's doorman saw this huge crowd, with so many of them wearing noble belts and boots, he ran to his sleeping master and woke the old man. He said, "Get up and quickly. This is no time for sleep or rest. Your guest is the king of the world, and he's staying in this humble little house of yours." Bit by bit, the old jeweler took in what his doorman was saying, and then his heart was in turmoil. He said to him, "What are you telling me? What's this about the king?" He was still drunk, but when at last he realized what he was being told, he leaped up and he shouted, "A wise old man like you doesn't say things like this," to which his doorman responded, "Since you're so experienced, tell me, who has made you the king of Iran?" At dawn, before the sun came up, your guest groom hung a golden whip covered in jewels on our door, right where people passed by our house. When he heard his doorman out, the old man woke up completely and said, "And I got drunk last night in front of the King of Kings? And had my daughter serve him wine?" He went to Arzu's room and said to her, "My dear, you've always loved your freedom. Well, that was Bahram, the King of Kings, who came to our house last night, and he had been hunting and turned aside from the road to Kaadais. Now get up and put on your Chinese silk gown and put on that diadem you were wearing last night. Make him a present of some of our best jewels. Give him 3 rubies worth of a king. When you see his sun-like face, before him, cross your hands over your breast and don't look him in the eye. You're to think of him as your own body and soul. If he questions you, speak gently, humbly, and respectfully. I won't put in an appearance unless he calls me and places me among his servants. To think that I sat at the table with him last night as an equal. It makes me want to smash every bone in my body. How could I be so forward with the king? Why? Leads young and old astray." At that moment, a slave ran in and said, "His Serene Highness, the king, has woken up." Bahram woke, feeling healthy and happy, and went into the garden where he washed his head and body. He prayed before the sun, and his heart was filled with the hopes of God's favor. Then he went and sat down and called for someone to serve him wine. When he heard about his subjects gathered at the door waiting for him, he ordered them to go back to the court. He asked that Arzu be sent to him, as he had a strong desire to see her. Arzu went to him with wine and her gifts, wearing her diadem and earrings. She bowed low and kissed the ground before him. The king smiled at her and said, "You made me drunk," and then disappeared. "Where have you been keeping these? But taking gifts from a woman is for others. All I want from you is your songs. Sing me those songs you told me about, the ones about hunting and battles and lances and the king's blows." Then he called her father. She was astonished at the king's kindly manner. The jeweler came in, his arms crossed over his chest, and stood before him, his king. He said, "Your Majesty, how wise, how noble, how great, how brave, how heroic, and how learned you are. Before you, a person with any sense can only choose to be silent. My sin came from ignorance. You must think I'm crazy. It would be fitting for you to forgive my sin, because I am a foolish slave at your door, and the King of Kings cannot consider me as someone possessed of any intelligence." The king replied, "Wise men don't take offense at anything done by someone who is drunk. If a man is made surly by drinking wine, then he should leave it alone. But I saw nothing bad in you when you were drunk. But now we'll listen to Arzu, and you can consider her song among the tulips and jasmine as your excuse. As she sings, we'll have some wine and give no thought to the days that are yet to come." Mahai kissed the ground, brought in a table, and made everything ready, and then invited the nobles who were standing outside the door. Arzu went to her own room, frowning at the appearance of these strangers, and stayed there until the heavens put on their black veil, and stars came out around the moon. When they had eaten, Arzu was summoned and seated on a throne worked in gold. Mahai told her to take up her harp and sing the song that the king had mentioned. Arzu sang, "Brave king, at whose name lions disappear, leaving their dens to slink away in fear. Destroyer of your foes, victorious king, whose face is like a tulip in the spring. No king is tall like you. The moon at night does not possess your beauty or your light. When your victorious armies take the field, your enemies disperse, their forces yield, their hearts break in despair in headlong flight, their ranks are broken, and they cannot fight." And as they grew happy and tipsy with the wine, they progressed from small cups to large. Rusbeh joined them, and lodgings were found for him in the village. Bahram summoned 40 charming servants. Their Byzantine faces were as beautiful as the Byzantine brocade, and they escorted Arzu to the king's harem, where they placed a jeweled crown on her head. The King of Kings and Rusbeh returned cheerfully to the palace, and Bahram made his way to his jasmine-scented beloved. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends.